Everybody. My name is Leah, and I'm the administrative assistant here with Africa Fire Mission. And I just want to welcome you all to today's training. I'm so excited to see everybody here today. I just can't wait for the training today. I just want to remind everybody that this is recorded and we're going to be posting it on our YouTube channel later today or tomorrow, just if you want to go back for later viewing, or if you would like to share it with colleagues, we always invite you to do that. This is just such an important training, so please feel free to share it with whoever you like. I also want to ask everyone to keep themselves on mute during the training unless you have a question. Always feel free to unmute if you want to ask a question, or you can type it in the chat and I'll be monitoring that and keeping my eye out. So we'll make sure everyone has their questions answered today. And I also want to remind everybody that we are going to be sending out certificates if you attend at least 70% of today's training. That's usually roughly around 45 minutes. And if you do attend that, then I'll be sending out the certificate. But if you would please change your name on Zoom with the name you want on your certificate, that's where I get all the names from. So if it's incorrect here on Zoom, it'll be incorrect on your certificate. And then I also invite you all to stay after the training for a little bit of tea time with Jose, and just having some casual talk with him and talking about all the things you guys experience in the fire service that might not directly correspond with today's training, but are just still very important to chat about. So I'm going to pass it off to our fire advocate, or fire safety advocate, Jose, for today's word of encouragement.
Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you so much, Hersch, for finding time to come. And then I'm so excited about today's topic. Today's topic is very close to my heart because it's one of the things that I've been finding, or I've been experiencing when I'm going to the firehouses around. I've been around firehouses the last 3 weeks, and this is a topic really close to my heart, you know. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, seeing people really cramming in, which is really exciting. Today's word of encouragement is more in relation to just the topic of today, you know, that we need to not bottle things up, you know. I'm just trying to look for words for that, but we don't try bottle things up within ourselves in the firehouse, and whatever we are going through, we need to speak it out. You know, I'm reminded of this Bible passage in the, a Bible verse, not really a Bible verse, but a Bible story of this king ruler called Naaman. Yeah, he was actually a commander, you know, in the army, in the king of Aram. And Naaman was suffering from leprosy, you know. And of course, without me reading throughout the story and telling you about the story, he was told to go dip himself 7 times in the sea, or is it in the lake, you know. But first of all, he was hesitant, you know. But I can imagine before he went and obeyed that cry, deep inside of him, I can imagine how he had bottled up him having leprosy. Oh, God has forgotten me. Oh, I'm feeling insignificant. And mind you, he was a commander. He could tell you, hey, go do X, Y, and Z. But I can imagine in his room, he would just go and just cry out, you know, until the point he had to go and say, you know what, I'll obey. I'll obey the word, the servant of God. And he went and dipped himself 7 times in the lake, or some, I think in the River Jordan or something, you know. So I just want to tell us that you might be feeling like powerful or in control. Not really powerful. You might be feeling in control in the fire service, but deep inside you're feeling you're hurting over a certain fire incident happened, or a car crash somewhere, and you're bottling up that matter. I'd really ask you, go talk with your colleague during the debrief sessions to avoid you entering into depression or another situation that can be wrong. So with that in mind, I encourage you to speak out. Thank you so much. And God bless you. Welcome to the class. Back to you, Leah.
Thank you so much, Jose. That was such a great introduction to what we are talking about today, which is suicide prevention. And so I just want to pass it over to Hersch. Take it away. Feel free to start sharing your screen and everything. Perfect.
First of all, my name is Hersch Wilson, and I want to say how excited I am to be here with you. I've been looking forward to this for months. Not only just to be with you, but to talk about mental health. I know it's a difficult topic for all of us in the fire service because we all kind of grew up in a situation where we're supposed to not talk about feelings and talk about emotions. So I really am excited to share this with you. And what I'd like to do is go through the presentation, but at any point, if anybody has any questions, Leah, if you want to just unmute and ask, that would be the best thing to do. So with no further ado, let me go ahead and start. So the title of this is called, It Could Never Happen Here, Suicide Prevention in First Responders. Let me get, and of course it's not working. Let's see. There we go. So again, my name is Hersch Wilson, and I've been with the fire service for 33 years. I just retired last year, yay. And I'm also the author of a book called Firefighter Zen, which is a field guide to thriving in tough times. My mission now as a retired firefighter and a retired chief is helping first responders get to the end of their careers emotionally and mentally healthy. We often talk about, the analogy I use is we often talk in the fire service about not hurting our backs. And one of the first things that we're taught is how to lift properly. I don't know if you guys have gone through that, but my first month in the fire department, my captain said, would just say, you're not lifting right, you're not lifting right, you have to lift with your legs, lift with your legs. If you don't learn how to lift with your legs, you're gonna hurt your back and you're gonna end up retiring with back injuries. So we spend a lot of time on being physically healthy and getting through our careers physically strong, but we don't spend a lot of time getting through our, making sure that we're emotionally and mentally healthy. And that's kind of my mission, is to help fire service people all over the world retire and get through their careers emotionally and mentally healthy. Before I start, however, I really want to take a minute to just honor our brothers and sisters, first responders in Ukraine, and just with them, maybe a moment of silence to kind of remember what they're going through right now. We've had firefighters and first responders killed as they're doing amazing work of putting out fires and rescuing people in the midst of a war. So if we could just take a minute just to kind of focus on them and send our prayers to them. Thank you for doing that. It's a tough, tough time. So the way I want to start is, remember that this presentation was designed for an American audience. And in America and Canada, suicide prevention and mental health are a priority for departments of our officers. But having said that, it'd be presumptuous of me to assume I know anything about these issues across the African continent. And I want to make sure that if I have assumptions that are incorrect, that you correct me, and just let me know that doesn't make sense in your cultures. I think, however, what brings us all together is that we are all exposed to trauma and suffering. And that takes a toll. That takes a toll on all of us. And that's kind of what binds us together as a brother and sisterhood in the fire department world. And the other thing we want to recognize is that all cultures, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in the Middle East, Europe, Asia, we all have assumptions and taboos concerning suicide. And I think one of the things we need to do, especially as officers, is kind of realize the assumptions and the taboos we hold, because in the end, our job is to help our fellow brothers and sisters in service, again, get to the end of their careers mentally healthy. So we can talk about, I'm going to share a slide here in a second about some American taboos and American assumptions about mental health and suicide, but it's important to kind of think about the ones we hold inside of us as we go forward. So in the West, some of our issues about mental health and suicide are shame. I feel shame if I admit to having depression. I feel shame if I admit to having a reaction to trauma. I feel shame if I even think about the idea of suicide. And another assumption in our culture is that suicide means weakness, that to someone committing suicide or attempting suicide, it's a sign of weakness. And as Jose and I were talking about before we began, we live in a culture in the fire service of suck it up, right? We should not show emotion no matter what we see. And we always talk about in the United States, in America, is we see things that no one should see, right? We see trauma that no one should see, but we're taught at the same time to suck it up, which is a very unnatural and unhealthy way to deal with the trauma we see. Next is even asking for help is a sign of weakness. So all of these, in my view, are untrue, but the idea of asking for help as a sign of weakness is really something everybody struggles with, especially men. We're taught not to ask for help. We're taught to suck it up. We're taught to be the strong ones, even though we might be eroding inside of us. So I want to start with, I want to tell a story. So the purpose of this presentation, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, is to help officers understand and again, this is the United States. We have a growing suicide epidemic, especially amongst first responders. Secondly, we want to remove the stigma about talking about mental health and first responders. So in our cultures here, we're trying to create fire service cultures where it's normal to talk about how I felt, how this call got to me, and how I'm doing. Then we want to understand the signs of a potential suicide, what people are going through when they start thinking about it, and finally focus on measures we can take to help prevent suicides. But I want to start just to kind of reinforce the effect of trauma on us. There's a story of a Marine battalion. This is an American Marine battalion, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. It goes like this. And I don't know if you could read along, but I'll go ahead and tell the story. So this man, Corporal Robert Miller, was 17 when he joined the Marine Corps. And he landed in the Pacific on Iwo Jima in 1944. They sustained the highest casualties of all the Marine divisions that landed. And he was interviewed in his 90s. This is when he was in his 90s, 69 years later, after Iwo Jima. He still sleeps with the television on. He still sleeps with the volume turned up high to drown out the sound of gunfire and screaming. This is almost 70 years later. Next, a journalist named Carolyn Carino. She's a therapist. She talked about her father's experience in that same battalion. In his 80s, he would sit in a chair in his living room on guard at night, having taped all the blinds shut. And he'd sit in the middle of the floor in the living room, and he'd drink to dull the memories, but he would stay low on the floor so he would be a smaller target for snipers. Again, this is 70 years after the war. And she reported that all the survivors, 100% of them had at one time or another tried to kill their wives, thinking that they were the enemy. So what's the point of that story? That the point of the story is that PTSD and trauma is a physiological disease. It's a physiological disorder. It's not making stuff up. It's not psychological. Trauma does physical damage to the brain. And this is something that in America, we're just coming to grips with after the unfortunate wars in Iraq and having our military veterans coming back. We're just understanding that PTSD is a physiological disorder. And I always think of it as just like, it's like having any kind of brain injury or getting the flu. It's a disease process. In 2022, we now know that trauma can affect us. It can cause depression and lead to PTSD and suicides. So the trauma we see, even though it's not us as the victims, but the secondary effect of trauma, the trauma we see can affect us physiologically, can cause depression and lead to PTSD and even suicides. But again, we're told not to talk about it. We're told in our brains not to talk about it because we're men. Next, as leaders, it's our responsibility in the fire service to understand these issues and use the best science to help prevent not only suicides, but to prevent and help people heal from PTSD and depression. So this is just a chart that tracks in the United States line of duty deaths versus reported suicides. And the suicides are probably underreported, so it's probably worse than we think. But you can see from starting in 2010 that, and going up to 2019, that line of duty deaths, the blue line, have actually decreased over time. We're getting better at being able to prevent line of duty deaths. And in the United States, line of duty deaths are primarily things like traffic accidents on the way to a scene. They are cardiovascular incidents on a scene. Somebody has a heart attack on a fire scene. And finally, actual exposure to fire as a cause of death. But we're getting better at that. But when you look at the pink line, you can see that reported suicides have increased. And that's partially because we're keeping better records, but it's also because suicide is a growing epidemic in the fire service. And so that by 2018, 2019, as an officer, you're more likely to have a firefighter die by suicide than you are to have them die in a line of duty death. And that's pretty shocking. That's pretty shocking. In 2017, 103 firefighters and 140 police officers died of suicide compared to 93 firefighters and 129 officer line of duty deaths. So that's just a staggering number for us, and something and that's one of the reasons that we're so focused on mental health, is to try to turn those numbers around. So the truth, if you're an officer, you're more likely to lose a firefighter by suicide or have them resign because of mental health issues than line of duty deaths. I just want to stop here. I think I have a question. Well, let me go a couple more slides and we'll get to questions. According to the American Medical Association, so understanding the background of what's going on, because it's not just being in the fire service, but culturally in the United States and I think in the Western world, we're seeing an epidemic of suicides. And according to the American Medical Association, in 2018, we're having the highest age-adjusted suicide rate since 1941, since before the Second World War. And according to the American Psychological Association, the rates of suicide have increased sharply since 2006. So we're seeing a big epidemic here of suicide and mental health issues. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death overall in the United States. Second leading cause of death amongst individuals between the ages of 10 and 34, and the fourth leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 35 and 54. There are almost twice as many suicides in the United States as there were homicides, which is a big deal in the United States because we clearly are the homicide kings for better or for worse. The other thing we deal with, and I don't know how this culturally translates, so you can let me know, but we've recently run up against this thing called death of despair. And much of the decline in longevity in our country has been higher rates of suicide, opiate overdoses, alcohol-related deaths of despair. Americans are drinking themselves, poisoning themselves with drugs, and shooting or hanging themselves. So we have a big issue about people being so despairing that they're taking their own lives. And then it seems to be getting worse with the pandemic and a recession and now a war, that these numbers will continue to grow. So I just want to stop here and answer any questions that anybody might have. Or Jose, and if you want to jump in too, that'd be great. Oh, you're
on mute, Jose.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Hersch. Any questions? Anybody would want to ask any question? This is your time before we can continue with the slides. So Hersch, I have a question.
Sure.
In regards to, for example, if a firefighter has an issue, like in America, do you people have a support system whereby I can walk into an maybe to a nurse and talk to her, or how do you go about it? Or do they go talk to the fire chief, or how do they go about
Sure.
it? Because here in Kenya, we don't have really a system
Right.
of how we should do it.
We have 3 levels of support. If we're in a good fire department, the first is what we call peer-to-peer. So I can go, we have firefighters who are trained in helping, listening and helping counsel other firefighters. So I can go to a firefighter in my department on a casual basis and say, hey, John, that call really got to me. Can we just go get coffee and talk about it? And that's permissible. For an example, we had an accident involving 5 teenagers. They were all killed. And there's this old veteran firefighter who had been in the service for 45 years. And 3 or 4 years later, we were standing in our station, and he just came up to me and said, you know, I thought they were all asleep. I didn't realize that they were dead. And I just can't get it out of my head that they were dead. And, you know, it took him, he's a veteran, military veteran and a firefighter. It took him almost 3 years to kind of ask the questions that had been bothering him for 3 years. So we, in the fire service in America, we encourage those kind of conversations now, not to wait for 3 years. So that we call that peer-to-peer, firefighters helping firefighters. The next level is we have a thing called critical incident stress debriefing. So this will be after a call, a few days after a bad call, where we call in a facilitator, someone who is experienced with dealing with this stuff, and we'll get everybody who was involved in the call. And it's voluntary. You don't have to go to these things. That's really important. That's voluntary. So we get a group together and we debrief the call, not only about the technical aspects of the call, you know, if it was a fire with fatalities, not just talking about the fire, but talking about how we're feeling, how it got to us. And those can be very effective. So that's our second level of helping firefighters deal with traumatic calls. The third level is we have with the career folks, and I've always been a volunteer, so we don't have this available for volunteers, but it's called it's the employee assistance programs, where the government provides psychological support and counseling if you need it. And that's not available for all departments, but on some of the bigger departments, it's called EAP, Employee Assistance Programs. So that's like going to a nurse, finding a nurse they supply that individual to the fire department. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Why don't we move on?
We have one more question real quick in the chat that just got sent in.
Sure.
It says, what characteristics what characteristics determine that one has PTSD?
That's a great question. So that gets into the kind of the symptoms, signs and symptoms, just like any other, like we're trained in EMS to look for signs and symptoms. So some of the signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder are inability to sleep, having nightmares. When I went through my PTSD period, I had uncontrolled anger, where I would just be, all of a sudden, I'd blow up at people. Then you start distancing yourself from people. You have intrusive thoughts, where all of a sudden you'll be going through your normal day, and you're right back at a call. You're seeing the call again. You're seeing the emergency. You're smelling the smells. You're hearing the voices. You're hearing the screaming. So when it becomes PTSD is when those things last longer than 3 months, and they begin to affect your normal day-to-day work, your normal day-to-day existence. So those are things to look out for.
More question.
I think Peter has a question.
I have one question.
Kitaka? Or who's that?
Goje.
Go ahead. Godian, go ahead, sir.
Okay, I'm asking, for example, when you're at workplace and then you have stress, and then at workplace, how will you manage that one?
I didn't understand the question, Jose. Did you understand the question?
Yes, I did.
When you have stress at workplace.
Stress.
When you have
you have stress in your workplace, how do you get to deal with that? That's Mr. Goje.
Okay, when you have a stress So when you have a stress in your workplace, how do you deal with that? When your workplace is stressful? That's a great question. And I know we all don't have ideal workplaces. And sometimes we have to, our first priority is, how do we take care of ourselves? What can we do to take care of ourselves, especially in a hostile workplace, right? And so next week, we're going to talk about that in more detail, about how we can build resilience and how we can deal individually with this kind of stuff. But I would say if a workplace gets so toxic that's really affecting your mental health, then it might be time to say, I need to find another job. I need to find another place to work. But if that doesn't work, I do things like I really control what I say to myself. I really control my self-talk. I really tell myself that it's my boss's problem, not my problem. Or I tell myself, I do things like I go on walks. I make sure I'm taking care of myself. Anything I can do to help myself in those situations. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And I think you have to be very aware of how bad a toxic workplace is. And we'll talk about that next week in detail. Any other questions?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
What are some of the symptoms that one would know that somebody is to an end, like they want to commit suicide? Are there symptoms that we will see?
We're going to get to that right in the presentation. So thank you for that question. We're going right to exactly answering those questions. Okay, good.
And there's one more question that just got posted in the chat as well. And they say, from the presentation, it seems like our daily operations at work might eventually affect our mental health much later in life. Can one detach himself or herself from daily routine of work and lead a normal life?
The answer is yes. And I think we're going to talk a lot about that next week. again, where we're going to get into what are the 6 things I can do to make sure that my work life and my exposure to trauma doesn't affect me in the long term. So that's a plug for next week.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Go ahead. Should we go ahead? Okay.
One more question.
Okay, go ahead. Yay. Una más.
As a crew commander, what do you do when you realize that some of your crew members are depressed, yet you have a limited crew and you are supposed to be on duty? What do you do?
So what do you do when you have crew members who are depressed, but you have limited what?
Limited manpower.
Limited
Yet
manpower.
Yet you are on duty.
Sure. And so if I'm as a chief, my responsibility first, and I applaud you for realizing that you might have depressed people in your crew, because lots of people, I mean, that's the first step. And lots of commanders and lots of chiefs don't even realize that. They don't look for it. So the first thing is to acknowledge that. The second thing is to say, everybody's a little different and needs to be treated differently. So some people you can get them in a group and talk about it. Other people are not going to be very responsive in a group and you need to deal with them one by one. But I don't think it's more formal than actually opening up the conversation to say, to talk about depression. So what I would do is inform myself as much as I possibly could about signs of depression, what will help in my local culture to help people overcome depression, and then meet with people either as a group or one-to-one. And I know it depends on schedules. It depends on your call volume at any given time, but that's probably the best approach to doing it. If that's not working, then I don't know what the mental health infrastructure is in your country, but we often will help people. We'll tell people to go and help them find a counselor that can help at a more professional level. We're not psychologists, we're not therapists, but we do understand what people are going through. We do understand that, and that's a very, very powerful tool to help. Good, going on? Thank you so much for the questions. So we'll have a time for more questions towards the end. Anyways, so just to get back to where we are. So first responders and firefighters, we swim in the same cultural sea as everybody else. We have the same stressors as everybody else, but then we also have a special group of stressors. So for firefighters, and this is all familiar for all of us, lack of sleep, interrupted sleep. I don't know how it is for you guys, but we can go 3 or 4 nights and be getting only 2 or 3 hours of sleep, depending on our call volume. Terrible nutrition. We don't eat very well because of our schedules. In America, and this is my editorial for America, we're in terrible physical shape, just in general. We don't eat well, we don't exercise enough, and we don't understand how important exercise is, and we don't understand how important personal wellness is. So that gets us into trouble. We walk around when we're on duty or as volunteers, because volunteers are on duty 24/7 all week long. We have a high state of alertness. So that drives all those stress chemicals in the brain. So we're always very, very alert and kind of jumpy about things, is just waiting for the pager to go off. And finally, we have those recurring movies in our minds of old calls that we're kind of recursively seeing, recursively going over. And it's so bad that in America, an average law enforcement officer sees 180 critical incidents in their career. So there's 180 traumatic calls that he or she has witnessed. and it's comparable, and firefighters have the same comparable number. So we have a lot of bad movies in our minds that sometimes just start playing in our minds without us having any choice. Volunteers, and this is probably true for a lot of you, we work in our own communities. So often we're seeing relatives and friends and acquaintances in traumatic situations. And I think if everybody, whether you're a career or volunteer, you have a second job, you have another job in order to support yourself. So that's just a very stressful part of the career. And volunteers are on duty 24/7. And for volunteers, and I work in a rural area, in a not a very wealthy community. So we have less wellness and mental health support than a lot of career firefighters in big cities. So that's all kind of, these issues kind of pile on top of a culture that's going through significant mental health issues. So in the United States, depression and PTSD affect 30% of our national first responders, compared to 20% of the general population. So, and while 3.7% of Americans have contemplated suicide, the rate jumps to 37% for fire and EMS professionals. 37% of us have contemplated taking their own lives. That's pretty dramatic. And again, I don't know how those numbers play out in the African continent, but that's pretty dramatic for America. So this gets back to the question, what are the signs that somebody is having about contemplating taking their own life? So it's the first thing to realize is suicide is a very complex disease process. And there's usually not just one cause of suicidal ideation. There's usually multiple causes. It's very complex. But things like being laid off, going through a divorce, financial challenges. It's really hard to be a first responder and you can't pay your bills. That just adds stress on stress on stress. Addiction, drug addiction and alcohol can play a large part of someone's contemplating suicide. And as we talked about, depression, acute anxiety syndrome, and PTSD can also leave people feeling hopeless and that they have no other choice other than take their lives. Any kind of abuse as a child, or being abused as an adult. And finally, if there's a family history of suicide. The way I think about it is that as you grow up as a child and someone in your family has committed suicide, it normalizes the idea of suicide as a way to solve problems. So that's something you should look for. So those are some of the signs that you can look for in someone who's comes to you and says, I'm not, or they may not come to you, but these are people that you want to take extra care in watching if they seem out of sorts. I think next is if they have easy access to a means of suicide. If they have a gun, right, or they have medications. In America, we have an epidemic of guns, as you all know. So access to guns is very easy, and access to medications like fentanyl is also an epidemic here. So if there's access to means of suicide, it makes it easier for someone to do it. And the triple threat, what we call the triple threat, is a depressed or someone with PTSD, easy access to a weapon, and then they're drinking or in drugs. So those are kind of, again, if it's easy to commit suicide, and if people have one or more of those other factors, they can be at risk. They can be at risk. Here's some other signs that individuals might be contemplating suicide. So if I'm an officer and I see these behaviors, that's going to send off bells in my brain. Again, a family history. if someone's talking about wanting to die or kill themselves, if they're looking for a way to kill oneself, they're talking about feeling hopeless or having no purpose. They're talking about feeling trapped or being in unbearable pain. We often have cancer patients that are in so much pain that they just want to take their lives. Talking about being a burden to others. If there's an increase in use of alcohol or drugs, if someone who has never used alcohol or drugs all of a sudden starts indulging, that's a sign. Someone who's acting anxious, agitated, or restless, reckless. Someone who's been always a safe on the fire department, someone who's always been kind of cautious and not doesn't take risks, all of a sudden is taking risks. That can be a sign that something's going on. They're not sleeping at all, or they're sleeping too much. They're withdrawing and feeling isolated. Showing rage, or talking about seeking revenge. And finally, extreme mood swings. If someone is happy one day and depressed and sad the next day, and then angry the next day, they're going through those mood swings, that's another sign that they might be contemplating suicide. So those are things not only as officers that we can look for, but also as when we look at our, the people on our team, our comrades, if they're going through that might be saying a time to pull somebody aside and say, how are you doing? What's going on? So the next thing I want to do is talk about what officers can do and how officers can help. And the most important thing, I'm going to add to this. So the most important thing is for us to realize that mental health, once we become firefighters, once we become first responders, that mental health is a priority, right? Keeping people healthy, emotionally healthy is a part of the job of an officer. It's not just making sure we have all the trucks rolling to a fire and then we know how to fight a fire or we know how to extricate people out of cars. Making sure that my people are emotionally healthy is a priority. And that breaks down into, I don't know how you guys do it, but we always do a tailboard debrief after difficult calls. So after a difficult call, once we've cleaned up, we'll get everybody at the back of an engine, talk about the call. And that's my opportunity to kind of look everybody in the eye and make sure that everybody is okay, right? So I'm not only saying, hey, we could have laid that hose differently, but I'm also looking to make sure that people are okay. For example, once we had another bad call, and at the end of the call, we got everybody together and talked about what we had to do next. And one of the younger members of the department said, I can help put stuff away, but I just can't help remove bodies, right? I can't help remove bodies from that car. So that was a sign to me that, first of all, he was being honest and admitting that he couldn't do something, which is important to do. But it was also a sign to me that this guy I need to follow up with him. So having that opportunity after call to look people in the eye and see how they're doing is really important. And then following up. So the way we follow up in our department is once we've located a couple of people who are not doing as well as they should after a bad call, we'll take them out to lunch. And that's kind of mandatory. We'll say, let's go out to lunch, let's talk about it. And then it's one-to-one, it's not in a group, and we can sit down and talk to them. But we keep an eye on our people in that way. And that doesn't cost any money, doesn't cost any time. It is a good way to keep an eye on people. And then finally, in the department, we make sure that everybody knows that it's okay to talk about these kinds of things, whether we're in our weekly meetings or our duty sections. It's okay always to talk about how I feel. So that's how we make mental health a priority. I think the next thing is educate, educate, educate. We need to know about depression. We need to know about PTSD. We need to know about suicidal ideation. I think the saddest thing that can happen, and this happened in our department and other departments, is someone actually kills themselves. And you go and you say to yourself, what could I have done? What did I miss? So it's super important to educate ourselves on the mental health stuff, on all the mental health stuff. So it goes along. I know there's so much education on our plate, and there's so much things we have to know, and we have limited resources, but understanding the aspects of mental health and what we can know about mental health is really important. Finally, as officers, it's important for us to model what we want other people to act like. So there's nothing more powerful than a chief saying, "This call really got to me. Here's why." I know it's hard for us because when we're in authority, we're supposed to be strong. We're supposed to be perfect. We're supposed to, I remember one officer telling me, "Things don't get to me." I mean, he was kind of the model of what it was like to be an officer in the old days. But now the new model is, things do get to me and I want to talk about them. And if I can model that kind of behavior, that opens it up for everybody else. Finally, and this is tricky, and because in the United States, depending on what kind of department you're on, there might be resources to help and there might not be. It might be just us as firefighters and that idea of peer-to-peer counseling, but really know what your resources are. Really know if there's psychiatric or psychological or counseling help available. So those are kind of my officer priorities, what we need to do as officers. Finally, we talk about this all the time, and this is the fire department culture. Our cultures have been predominantly and historically male. And as we talked about, the culture has always been suck it up, don't complain, don't show weakness. And PTSD and depression and suicidal ideation are signs of weakness. And number one, don't talk about it. I don't want to hear about how emotionally upset you are. And we learn this as boys, we learn this very young, that to be a man means not to show emotion, not to talk about it. So we don't want to express any emotion. And that's kind of the traditional culture. And in America, the fire culture started in 1736 with the first fire department. So this has kind of been embedded in us for a long time. But here's the culture we need. And I think this is the last slide, and then we're going to go to questions again. We need departments that are caring, that care for each other, not only officers caring for their people, but us on the department caring for other individuals on the department, whether it's on scene or off scene. We need to make sure that people understand that there's hope. If you're feeling depressed, there's stuff we can do about it. There's a way to get through it. We need departments where I can trust people to talk. I know that I'm going to be able to talk to people in the department and they're not going to come back and bite me in the butt. No bullying, no sexism is important. Open and honest conversations, right? A good department where we can have open and honest conversations. Finally, where it's okay to seek help. I know that in my department, I can seek help. I can go to get help from other people and from the officers in the department. And that we're proactive. We're not going to wait till something happens, but we're going to talk about and tell stories about mental health and issues. So those are kind of how we build a culture. Culture. Super important on a fire department. Leaders influence culture by how we show up. Do we show up as authoritarians? Do we show up as command and control? Or do we show up as caring? Do we show up as asking questions? Do we show up as telling stories? And do we give people permission to say, hey, I got a problem? Is there a process? And we talked about a couple processes like peer counseling, one-to-one conversations, one-to-group conversations. And am I going to protect my people when they have problems? Am I going to say, hey, it's okay, I got your back. It's okay to talk about this. So those are important things that leaders can do to influence the culture. The good news is that suicides are preventable and people want to help. People want to help when they find out that someone's in trouble. The American Veterans Administration, which deals primarily with military families, they have a hotline that saves on an average of 70 individuals a day who call in having suicidal ideation or depression. So we know we can help. We know this is that we can turn people around and help them avoid suicides. Finally, when people are surveyed, 94% of individuals, when asked would they help someone thinking of suicide, say yes. That if you come to me, if someone comes to me and say, gee, I'm having a really bad day and I'm thinking of taking my life, I want to help. And people naturally want to help. They're not going to avoid it. They're not going to avoid the conversation, but they're really going to jump in and help. So those are positive signs that we can really help with this problem. So finally, our number one job is to save lives, but our number two job is to protect our brothers and sisters, right? It is to make sure they're healthy, they're okay, and they're going to get to the end of their careers emotionally intact and physically intact. So that's all I have. I just want to spend some time answering questions. Are there questions in the chat room?
There are no questions in the chat right now, but feel free, anyone, you can either text it in the chat and I'll be looking out for those, or if you want to unmute right now, feel free to ask your question. Yes, it looks like Sammy has a question. Feel free to ask that.
Sammy, are you on mute? Any other questions? Sammy, can you maybe put your question in the chat box? Nope.
How can I get like?
Oh, we have. Oh, I'm sorry. You just unmuted yourself. There you go, Sammy.
Yes, I get that. How can I get these slides?
Speak much louder, bro.
How can I get these slides? The notes, I mean, that we're presenting now.
You're asking about the notes.
The notes.
Yes. We upload the video online. We don't issue the notes, but you'll get the upload of the video as soon as we can.
Okay.
Thanks, Sammy.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
We can also send the PowerPoint separately, if that'll help, so they can have the actual PowerPoint.
Yes, we post both the PowerPoint and the video online.
Okay, I knew you were ahead of me.
No, you're fine. And then we also have a few questions in the chat. One says, there are people who never open up when they have problems, but rather, sorry, it just went away. I got to scroll back up to it. But rather prefer to keep it to themselves and end up committing suicide. How can we help such people? So how can you help the people that keep it to themselves?
I think, first of all, we have to be really in touch with our people. We have to know our people. That's number one. And I mean, it's the simple things like not only seeing, you don't want to just see people in department meetings or on calls, but you want to have a personal relationship with your people so that you know what they're going through. In those cases, they might open up, but also you'll be able to see behavior change in people you know. So it's really important. The number one is to know your people, know your crews.
Then Simpson also asked a really good question. He said, how do you start a conversation with a colleague when you have noticed signs of depression?
The way I've been trained to do it is to say, so Leah, I know, I don't know about you, but I feel that call got to me. I've been feeling kind of depressed recently, and kind of put it on me first, and then then ask, so how are you doing? So first I say, that call got to me, or that call certainly had the possibility to get to me. I'm sure it's affected others. How are you doing? So you're not being confrontational, but you're being very indirect about it.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really helpful.
Well, you're the psychology major.
I don't have all the expertise
can I
to
ask you a
talk on
question?
this like you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm asking where I'm located now. Many people that we work together don't take alcohol. Some of them take loans, and then you say the dividend is very high. You see someone just talking to himself, throwing hands. How can you help such a person?
So
You
that
cut
was,
out a little bit at the end. Could you say that one more time?
No, sometimes you see the person is throwing his hands and talking to himself. He's not free to talk. He's not free to come and talk to you. How will you face such a person?
not free to come talk to you.
Mhm.
That's hard. I'd want to know why he's not free to talk to me, first of all. And is it because he doesn't want to talk, or he's not used to talking about these kinds of things? I think what I want to be able to do is know him or her well enough so that I can see behavior changes. And sometimes I might have to actually ask a very direct question like, how are you doing? I would like to talk to you about what I think is, you seem depressed, you seem angry, and I'd like to talk to you about that. So sometimes it's me getting outside of my comfort zone and being direct with a question and not being afraid, because my job as an officer is to take care of my people. And sometimes that means being very direct.
And then we have one more question in the chat. It's from Errol, and he said, how do you relate socially to a colleague after an attempted failed suicide?
Oh, that's a really important question. And it depends on the individual. I think someone who's attempted suicide, if you can put yourself in their shoes, they're going to feel an enormous amount of shame, anger, frustrated. They might be relieved that they actually they didn't succeed, or they might be upset that they didn't succeed. So it depends on the individual. So what I want to do is be very sensitive to them. I don't want to call them out. I don't want to talk about them in front of a group. I want to talk to them one to one, and ask them what I can do to help. That it's okay. We know you're going through a lot of stuff, and we're here to help, and to make sure that you keep open that channel of conversation. I think the worst thing you can do is probably talk about that person in front of a group, or have them stand up and talk about what happened. So I would keep it very private. And the core thing is to say, what can I do to help?
That's perfect. Thank you. Mike, your hand is raised. Do you have a question to ask?
Yeah. Hello, this is Kahindi from Mariakani. First, I want to commend for the lesson. It came at a proper time because one, in our duty stations, we are experiencing these problems or symptoms to some of our colleagues. And yet when we try to come to the root cause, or we try to investigate, we found that some of our colleagues committed their salaries to huge bank loans, and as a result, they get peanuts monthly, which cannot sustain for their families' upkeep. And then this affects some of the colleagues in that they try to behave in a manner like they are going to it's like now they are like heading to PTSD. I don't know. So how do you deal with such a situation? Yet the guy has got so many months before he can conclude his loan debt, the installments, before he can again start getting a good pay. How do you deal with it?
That's a really good question. And we have similar problems in the United States where firefighters are not very good at financial planning and they get into debt. And so lots of firefighters have one or have more than, they have two jobs. So there's two things. Long-term, what we do is help firefighters become better financial planners. And we offer financial planning courses. I think in the short term, it's hard. It's just so hard. So what we want to do is help them. I guess what I would do if I had a firefighter who was in desperate financial straits, I would sit down with them, help them come up with a financial plan, so they can pay off their debts as a first step. And then second step would be to really help them kind of deal with it emotionally. And a lot of the stuff we've talked about, I think reaching out to help somebody is the first step. And you don't know what you're going to get into, but if someone says to me, if I'm in trouble, said, "Hey, Herschel, how can I help?" That's a big step forward.
Thank you. And I know we have a few more questions. A hand is raised, and I have a question here in the chat, but we are out of the official time. And so I'm just going to transfer us into tea time for a little bit. So please, everyone, feel free to stay for that as well. And Hersch, if you could just stay for a little bit to answer questions, that'd be much appreciated. But I just want to thank everyone for coming to the training today. And thank you so much, Hersch, for leading it and having this presentation for us. It's something that is so important, and it can sometimes feel a little emotionally exhausting if we're not used to talking about it, but it is so important to talk about. So thank you very much. And I just ask everyone to share the link for next week's training, because Hersch will be back with us and he'll be talking about resilience building. So feel free to share the link that you register with your colleagues and with your friends that might be interested as well. And I'm going to be sending out our survey here in the chat. And so please